All right, welcome everybody to the Talk to Me Petey D podcast, my podcast where I talk about people management, leadership, and productivity. So today we are at episode 20, so a nice little milestone here. We're going to take a look into the books I read in November 2024. But before I get into that, I'm going to remind myself to do a little shameless self-promotion since I'm not normally so great at that. So if you like this podcast, wherever you're watching it or listening to it, please subscribe, share it out. I'd love getting kind of a larger audience and interacting and talking with people. If you have any feedback, please reach out, let me know. If you're into reading and into these topics around leadership, management, productivity, please check out my book, People Management from the Ground Up. You can order it on Amazon, both in print and digital copies. If you like the ideas I talk about here, you'll like the ideas that you find in the book. So there you go. Quick and painless, but please, support these different areas if you're interested and like what you hear. So, books I read in November 2024. So, starting off with Tribe of Mentors by Tim Ferriss. I had seen this book recommended a couple places. I actually picked it up a while ago, but if you can see, if it's pretty thick, I think it's like 500 something pages. So I was like, oh boy, this is it's going to be a little bit intense getting into, but actually it's super easy to read. It's a series of interviews with a bunch of well-known people from all sorts of different areas. So I think it's 5 or so questions that are more or less the same for everybody and getting to see how they respond. So you can easily read a couple of these in a sitting, very digestible, big print and things like that too. So on the surface, it looks like this monster, but really not so bad at all. So let's see. Some of the things that I liked about it, it was a really good source of other books to read. So you can kind of see what people mentioned, what they were interested in. There's actually a list that Tim has on his website. We can go and see all those books. But as I went through, I kind of just took some notes. I think the one that was mentioned the most was Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. So I picked that one up. I heard about it, but I hadn't read it yet. So that'll be on my list for December reading. What else? It's always interesting to me to kind of look at these successful people and see what are the things that they all have in common, the recommendations that are consistent across people. And you kind of, that's a good way to come to consensus about things that are effective. So as I read through this and all the different people that are in there, it was cool to kind of keep an eye out and see what things they all had in common. At the same time, there were a few people that were sort of outliers on the things that they liked, or maybe they didn't like things that were in common to other ones. So that's always interesting as well. Not necessarily that that's something that you want to go and do, but the answer is not always to do what everybody else is. Sometimes there might be something that works for you or for a particular person that is completely different than what other people do. Um, One of the quotes that I have here that I hope will resonate. So thinking about reading and all the information that we have access to. So this is the quote: the means of learning are abundant. It's the desire to learn that's scarce. So I thought that was really profound and trying to encourage that desire to learn in myself and in others as well. Um, some other interesting quotes were around rest. So you might think for all of these very successful people, or thinking about productivity and things like that, sometimes it's easy to forget about the value of rest and taking breaks from work. Um, so the quote is, growth and gains come from periods of rest. I've certainly found that true in my life. Sometimes I'm going and trying to work on things and make progress. And then for whatever reason, if I have opportunity to take a step back, that's often where the insight comes, or the new ideas. So important to bake that in, even as you're trying to maybe, do a lot of things in life. Um, and let's see, one last quote here that I liked a lot. and I forget who all these are attributed to, but that can be your task if you want to go check this out. Our humanity is expressed most fully in our treatment of others. So, um, thinking about not just treating others well for their benefit, but as that being an expression of our best selves and how to live our best life. So I thought that was really cool. So just a couple bits from that. There's a huge amount of information in there, but don't be scared. It looks big, but it's actually one of the easier books that I read this year. Next up, book number 2, Meditations for Mortals by Oliver Burkeman. I read his 4,000 Weeks a while ago. Really like his style of writing. He wrote in a paper, I think it was in England, about various productivity systems, and kind of spent his life searching for the perfect productivity system, and kind of looking at the system as an answer to life's problems. So he's done a lot of work there, and really found that there is no perfect system. And he talks a lot about this idea of sort of being an imperfectionist, but not having kind of the perfect way to do things, but being able to go and do them. So this one is written with the idea that you'll read one passage a day over the course of a month. They're pretty easy to read. I cheated a little bit. I think I read one in the morning and one in the evening. I think it is good to try and not do too much, so you sort of let it absorb in, but didn't totally follow the directions there. One of the quotes I liked from it is, "We have this misguided idea that reality can and should be made controllable," which obviously it cannot, but trying to sort of bend things to our own will, as opposed to sort of embracing the unpredictable nature of things. And then we have to confront that our limitations of what we can control and what we cannot. He talks about this idea with those of us concerned with productivity, that there's always a higher goal, and it's whenever you achieve a goal that you're working towards, there's the next goal that comes up in the distance, and that can be exhausting. It can be anxiety producing. So just something to be aware of, if you fall into that vein that many of us do. One of the things that I really liked about his quote, and especially for those of us that are trying to read a lot, is to treat your reading pile like a river and not like a bucket, in the sense that a river flows by, and you may have some books that you want to read, or recommendations or articles, and some you pick out of that river and you read, and some float by and you don't, and you can let that go, as opposed to the bucket that some of us think, okay, this bucket is constantly filling up with recommendations and I'm never getting it to them, and I have to try and continuously dump out this bucket that's overflowing. And that can be a more stressful way to think about it, as opposed to just, these are things that come by, some I'll read and some I won't. And that's something that it's definitely become very tangible to me this year, trying to read more than I ever have. Is it's still a drop in the bucket, so to speak, in terms of the number of things there are out there to read, that it's more about the process, and not trying to get to some end goal there. So let's see what else. Yeah, it's interesting. He talks about sort of the maximum amount of intense mental focus we can have during a day is around 3 to 4 hours. So instead of just trying to kind of push yourself all the time and just work harder and harder, is just being able to have a period where you're really focused, you're delivering a lot of value and impact with your work. Very similar to things that Cal Newport has talked about with deep work, and having that concentrated period, but then also having some time where you're resting after that, and not trying to sustain that beyond a certain period. And what deep and intense work may mean for you, may be an individual thing, and you may have other less intense work that you do during the day, but thinking about that as just as an upper limit on what we're capable of. Another interesting one was sort of how we look at other people who are successful or productive and what we see. And his quote was about not comparing your insides to their outsides. So, with ourselves, we see everything, all of our imperfections and fears, and anxiety. And on the surface, especially with successful people or people we see on social media or other places, we're only seeing the successful side of that, not what's going on underneath. And kind of this idea that there's this pressure to be extraordinary, to be the entrepreneur who starts some hugely successful company or all of these sorts of things, and just realizing that that's the minority of people in the world, and you can have a very satisfying life, and find a lot of meaning in that without having to be that extraordinary person, but just being the kind of best and truest expression of your own individual self. Um, and lastly, it's really a book about sort of accepting these limitations of ourselves, how much we can work, how much control we have over things, and instead of that being a negative or kind of a depressing thing, it's really a impetus for us to take action, to not be held back to trying to be perfect or trying to be extraordinary, but just trying to do what we can and to make progress. So um, another really good book. Enjoyed that one as well. So let's see. Book number 3, Confronting Our Freedom, by Peter Block and also Peter Kostenbaum. So essentially by Peter Block, Peter Kostenbaum is a professor of existential philosophy, and a lot of his work is referenced in this book, but it's primarily written by Peter Block. So I will just caveat that if you're sort of not into combining management and leadership with existential philosophy, this one might be a lot. I really enjoy Peter Block's The Answer to How is Yes. That's probably a more accessible way to start in this genre than just jumping right in with this. But I really did enjoy this book as well. Just maybe not the starting point for you if you're kind of not already in this genre of existential philosophy and management. One of the quotes that it starts out with, which I liked a lot, is anxiety is the price you pay for your freedom, um, which I think is really profound, that when we're stuck making choices or maybe perseverating about what to do, we should always look at that as, this is a place where we have some freedom to decide what to do. And that's why we're facing this anxiety. So it's a trade-off, and that's the price we have to pay if we want to be free. So a lot of what this book is exploring is sort of how we bring more freedom into organizational life, or what that might look like. Um, it builds on themes that I've read Block talk about in other books, where taking more accountability to individuals as opposed to having the organization or managers be responsible for some of these things, putting that responsibility on the individual employee, and thus giving them more freedom, and having them have their own personal accountability on things. So uh, yeah, just having, I'll kind of touch on some themes from the book and some things that I took away, is instead of having managers so much guiding the path of employees, or organizational groups doing it, putting that more on the employee to be more self-directed and figure out their path and figure out their learning and what they're going to do. So I think it's interesting to think about, especially in large organizational settings, how that all can work. And this idea of freedom and sort of individual direction, and how that's a bit radical in an organizational setting, where especially if you're very structured and hierarchical and have a strong culture of management led organizations, that this is a very different type of idea. So um, I think it's useful to read these sort of things, even especially if you're in kind of a more structured organization, and thinking about ways that um, relaxing maybe some of that organization, or changing the where the accountability lies and where the direction lies, there's some real power in that. Um, Talking about sort of systems of rewards, or systems of punishment for getting certain performance behaviors or behaviors in an organization, whereas there's certain philosophies like what gets measured gets done, things like that, and how those systems are really critical for driving the outcomes that you want, may not be the best way to get there in all cases. And it's not saying that rewards are bad, and it talks about these are useful, but they're not everything. They're not decisive, and that um, they're going to help incentivize behavior, but a lot of that intrinsic motivation is not captured in a rewards or punishment system. That's something that comes from individual people working in an environment that's more self-directed motivation on what they're going to do. Um, which builds on this idea, and again, a little bit radical sense, is that employees don't need to be motivated, or don't need to be motivated by their managers or their organization, um, and challenging that assumption that that's the role of managers, and thinking of that more as an intrinsic human trait. And if you don't rely on managers in the organization to do that, then you're putting that responsibility on employees to be self-directed and to motivate themselves. But within a lot of these structures, if you say, okay, well, as a manager, I need to motivate these employees, then in a way you're taking away the responsibility for them to do it themselves. So interesting to think about there. Um, this idea about leadership, that sometimes we think about leadership as being a scarce skill or a scarce trait. His point here is that leadership is abundant in the organization, and finding ways to um, allow more of that to happen, and with increasing freedom and individual accountability, then you're able to take more advantage of that leadership capability within the organization. Um, and this idea of freedom as um, choosing accountability, choosing motivation, as opposed to um, being compliant with a particular way the organization says you need to do things, or certain values. Um, so freedom means that you're choosing yourself, that you're going to be accountable for these different things, as opposed to doing it because that's the system that you're in. Getting into a little bit more of the existential side, there's even some discussion of looking at death and evil, and that in our own life, but also in organizational life, right? This concept that organizations, or kind of groups within an organization, have their own lifespans, and sometimes we look at them as they're sort of immortal or will last forever, but they're finite just like us. And um, how that mindset can help us overcome indecision at times. In the same way, thinking about the past book, Meditations for Mortals, this idea that when you can escape perfectionism, that helps you get started. In the way, it's the same type of concept, that we think about ourselves and our organizations as finite. So we don't have to be perfect there before we can get started. So it's another way to move into action from planning. Um, Really interesting one was thinking about role definition, and this idea that if we don't have very defined roles and responsibilities within organizational life, that's just going to lead into chaos. Um, so I think this is a really interesting challenge to conventional thinking, because I've definitely been along those lines, or been in organizations that think that way, and I think there's plenty of truth in that as well. But also sort of that while you may be fighting chaos on one hand, you're also fighting bureaucracy and too much control and sort of stricture on what people do, by overly defining roles and scoping them in a way that people can only be bounded to those definitions. So it's an interesting trade-off, what's the right amount of sort of chaos to allow, and that may depend on the type of work that you're doing or the company or the organization. Um, so I thought that was a really interesting piece to challenge kind of the traditional wisdom that you need to be really defined and clear on what roles are and what type of work they do. Um, then kind of going back to thinking about the role of managers and organizational leaders and the traditional view that sort of managers have all the answers, and being able to have an organization where managers or leadership can say we don't know, and how that's kind of rare. And without that, we're always sort of going to have unfulfilled expectations for the people in our organizations, because they're expecting us to know everything and to be able to provide the answers. But again, that's kind of going back to that theme of freedom, that if we don't expect leadership to give every answer to people in the organization, then it's going to be up to them to go and figure out what those answers are and how to solve those problems on their own. And the last quote, and this one was one I really liked from this book: risking effectively is an art that matures through experience. So oftentimes we'll talk about, failing fast, experimenting, taking risks, being courageous in the work that we do. And I think that is absolutely a skill that you develop, and wisdom and experience that comes over time, by taking smaller, more calculated risks, seeing how that happens, being able to read an environment, seeing how you react. So I like this idea of that it's something that you build up and mature over time. So there you go. Book number 3, Confronting Our Freedom. Next, book number 4, How to Be a High School Superstar by Cal Newport. So if you know me, you know I'm a huge Cal Newport fan, trying to read everything in his canon. I think I have all but 2 now at this point. So on the surface, this is about how to get into an elite college from high school without burning yourself out. I wasn't really reading it for that purposes. It may, come in to be useful in the future. One of the things that was interesting to me is that even though this was written a while ago, I can sort of see the philosophy that Cal Newport has today, captured in this early writing. So don't do too much. Don't try and be busy all the time and burn yourself out. Try and leave yourself open to get deep into certain areas and cultivate an interesting life for success. And that's very much something that I see in all of his books and in the philosophy that he talks about today. So if you're into his stuff in general, this will be an interesting book, even if you don't really care about getting into an elite college as a high school student. So let's see. Again, calls out building a reading life as another tool to help you get into an elite school. And no surprise, along all of the other things that he's talked about, or what I'm talking about here, is being able to build that reading life. And I think if you're able to do it at an early age, I think that can be really powerful. It's not something that I really did until somewhat recently, getting more serious about it and kind of using it to build up my own skills and knowledge and sort of way of thinking about things. Definitely read throughout my life, but not so much as a practice, and certainly not so much separate from school, especially in high school. Read some, but not as kind of a deep practice. So that was cool to see there. One of his ideas is that you don't necessarily have to find your natural talent. So that may be seductive to go into a bunch of different things to say, okay, where do I have a natural ability that others don't have in a particular area to stand out? So in order to find that, you might say, okay, I need to go try a bunch of things, and I'm going to be very busy. His contention is that, yes, that is a path to success, but it's relatively rare. Whereas sort of leaving yourself open to these deep and interesting opportunities is something that anyone can do, and you just need to leave some space to be able to find those. Um, and then you're not leaving it up to your natural abilities. You're just looking for those opportunities and those experiences to get deep in a particular area that interests you. And being interesting is a great way to stand out and to open up more opportunities. Um, and the last piece was kind of this idea of the productivity purge. Periodically we all may find ourselves in times where we're overscheduled or we have lots of things going on. Um, in this case, it was sort of looking at from one semester to the next. If you've really scheduled too much, that's a great point in time to kind of stop and take a step back and do less. But I think those are things that, regardless of where we are in life, we can, whether it's quarterly, things like that, stop and reflect on the things that we're doing and see if we're doing too much and maybe we need to step back. And sometimes we need to do less to leave ourselves open to new opportunities or getting, deeper in areas that we're interested in. So there you go. If you like Cal Newport's stuff and this sort of thing, I think it's an interesting and fun read. Even if you're not interested in moving from high school into an elite university. All right. Last but certainly not least, book number 5. Um, Who Wrote This by Naomi Baron. How AI and the Lure of Efficiency Threatened Human Writing. So a topic near and dear to my heart as somebody who writes and also somebody who works with AI. Um, so one of the things that I tell people, AI and technology in general is moving fast. So I think some people are skeptical about how valuable a book is because things may have changed. Um, this book is a couple years old, so some of the technology around generative AI has moved on. But the deep ideas and the things to think about don't change that quickly. So I think it's really valuable to both stay up to date on the cutting edge and what's changing. But if you want to get into these deep ideas, I think books are still a great way to do so. Um, so the fundamental question that this book starts with is that we need to think about what human skills are we comfortable about outsourcing. In this case, thinking about writing, but in general, that's something that applies to many things in AI. And if we don't make conscious decisions about that, um, things are just going to happen on their own without our input, and it may or may not be where we want to end up. One of the interesting questions that she poses as well is if we become so reliant in our writing and our communications on various generative AI features, spelling, grammar, suggestion, prompts, outlines, summaries, things like that, we should ask ourselves, like, could we actually write effectively if those services were down? Um, Not that we would necessarily have to do that, but it's just interesting to think that are we really atrophying our skills so much that um, we lose our ability to write and to communicate without these tools. I think that's one of the key things. It's not the argument that these tools aren't useful in a lot of areas, um, but we just have to be aware that as they make us better in certain areas, if we're not consciously maintaining some of these skills or doing them independently of AI tools, we're probably going to lose them. And to understand if that's a trade off that we're comfortable making or not. And the danger behind that, and I'll quote her here, is um, we forget what applying our writing skills can do for our intelligence and for our psyche. So it's not just the outcome of the writing, it's the internal transformation of building up how we think better and more critically, how we can be more empathetic, but also how we feel, sort of our internal sense of awareness, our connection to the world and to others. And I think that is something that as we lose some of our ability to write, if we're too dependent on these tools, um, that's the most kind of scary thing to me, that as a society and a people, if we lose those things, it's going to have negative consequences. Um, yeah, and then kind of that was the big idea, but also thinking about language and grammar, and how there's nuance in that meaning and word choice matters. So, as communicators, as writers, we are intentionally picking words that carry a particular meaning for us that we're trying to communicate. Oftentimes, with generative AI, there's a more simplistic word choice or even just different word choices, and we're losing that nuance and that very specific meaning that we want to communicate as authors, or potentially losing that if we're not writing it ourselves in some of these areas. So, um, quick summary of this book: it's definitely not saying we shouldn't use these tools, but there are things to think about and intentional decisions we're going to have to make, both as a society and then as individuals. Thinking about how we want to maintain our own communication abilities and how being able to communicate well and effectively affects us as a person and our own development and intelligence. Um, so yeah, lots to think about there. So um, those are my 5 books that I read November 2024. Had a kind of nice reading schedule this month. The previous months had been a little bit all over the place, so I was able to get into a good routine and should be on target to hit 60 books this year, which will be a record for me, a goal I set for this year. So I'm sure I'll share more about that later. But I hope you enjoyed. Happy reading to you. Let me know if you have any thoughts on these books, and be well. Thanks.